Suddenly, all of the lies that have been told to us about COVID, about the vaccines, and about everything related to this tragedy that we just went through lockdowns and masking, all that, suddenly all those lies are being trickle-truth back out by the media. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Chris Martinson. We're going to take a look at this because we are close to victory for those of us who care about truth, justice, and the American way. Not sure about those last two, but the truth is beginning to come out about all these vaccines and the vaccine injuries and even something called Ivermectin. Duizabin in the old days. Can I say that out here in public? I sure can on some platforms. Maybe not all, but we'll test that today. We're going to talk about this plus something called the common knowledge game. As a review, the common knowledge happens when everybody knows that everybody knows something. And the prime metaphor for that would be the parable or the story or the tale about the emperor who has no clothes. As you know the story, the emperor has this tailor who makes finer and finer clothes till eventually the emperor is wandering naked through the town. And there's a great procession out there, and everybody can see with their own eyes that he's naked. But it's still what's called private knowledge, because you know he's naked, I know he's naked, everybody else knows he's naked, but that's still something that we each know individually, or maybe even in small groups, until the child points and says, he's got no clothes. And then everybody knows that he's naked, right? And then all of a sudden the game changes. Suddenly, instead of wandering proudly up the street, the king hastily beats a retreat in some sort of shame. Okay, and embarrassment. Common knowledge happens when everybody knows that everybody knows something. So right now I submit to you it's private knowledge, still to this day, how bad these vaccines are and how much injuries they cause. But as we saw, the New York Times just had a front page article on maybe thousands of people believe that they've been injured. And as well, we saw other people come out of late, Chris Cuomo. So we'll talk about this a little more because we are close to that moment when everybody knows that safe and effective was not one lie. It was two lies. Did you know that Wall Street and the banking system have laws and rules in place that threaten your ownership of nearly all the equities and bonds in your portfolio and retirement accounts? Well, hello, I am Dr. Chris Martinson, and I have done hundreds of hours of concentrated research and collaborated with legal and securities experts on all aspects of the concepts covered in the book, The Great Taking by David Rodgers Webb. Together, we have identified 7 key strategies that you can leverage immediately to protect your wealth from these risks and regulatory takings. Join me and 6 industry experts, including David Rodgers Webb, on June 15th at 11 o'clock Eastern for a digital webinar with live Q&A, where we will outline and explain all of these strategies and how you can leverage them to protect your wealth. Further, your ticket will allow you playback of the webinar once it's posted. I want to orient us because this is the narcissist's prayer. We have a highly self-absorbed narcissistic society, and unfortunately, a lot of people with this particular trait tend to rise pretty high up in power because they care about nothing but themselves. They care about their own self-image. They will do or say anything shamelessly in order to advance their aims. And so you end up with a lot of cluster B sociopathic trait personality types at the tops of power because they don't have compassion. They don't have empathy, and they don't have shame, and they don't have any self-governance around their own behavior sets because they don't care about anybody but themselves. But this is a narcissist prayer. If they do something to you, they will first say, it didn't happen. And if you keep pushing back, they'll say, well, if it did, I guess that happened, but it wasn't that bad. Come on, get over it already. Why are you crying? It wasn't that bad, right? And then they say, well, if it was, this is not a big deal. Come on, people have been hurt worse than this. There's starving children in Africa, whatever. They'll try and minimize it. And then they'll say, well, oh gosh, if it was bad, it wasn't my fault. And if it was my fault, well, I didn't mean it. And if I did, well, you deserved it. This is where we are. We've gone all the way through this narcissist prayer. See if you can detect elements of the narcissist prayer as we step through this presentation. Now, we're going to start here with Dr. Deborah Birx back. I think this is from 2023. maybe 22. I forget exactly when this clip came from, but this is back when she was doing her book and what we call your CYA, your cover your rear tour. This is her trying to resurrect and refurbish her particular, well, her reputation, I guess. So let me make sure I've got my audio up here. Pull this up. Here we go.
And you're in the middle of this wave. What's going to save you right now is Paxlovid. But once we get through this wave, during the lull, you should get vaccinated and boosted because we do believe it will protect you, particularly if you're over 70. I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines, and it made people then worry that it's not going to protect against severe disease and hospitalization. It will, but let's be very clear. 50% of the people who died from the Omicron surge were older, vaccinated. So that's why I'm saying, even if you're vaccinated and boosted, if you're unvaccinated right now, the key is testing and Paxlovid.
Yeah, you know, that Pfizer product didn't really work, but we have another Pfizer product. We think it works better. No bueno. But let's listen in on the lying here, because this is pretty amazing. Okay, so bring the volume up.
Wave, what's going to save you right now is Paxlovid. But once we get through this wave, during the lull, you should get vaccinated and boosted because we do believe it will protect you, particularly if you're over 70. I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think
I knew these vaccines weren't going to protect against infection. I just never said that back when it would have mattered, and when Anthony Fauci was busy talking about herd immunity and Biden was busy saying that, you know, we have a pandemic of the unvaccinated. And when we had Rochelle Walensky saying, oh, yeah, you know, the way that you stop this thing by transmission is by getting vaccinated. So we now know, I mean, this was such complete junk at the time. It was just junk science. Even if those things were true, it was junk science because, and they weren't true, but even if they were true, it was junk science because we didn't have any of the studies that could have shown that. They just went forward with the statements about it and then claimed that if you were against that, you were anti-science, when in fact the essence of science is making statements that you can verify and back up with actual data. So this was kind of offensive to me, and Deborah Birx is very offensive, but here she is attempting to, you know, talk about how these vaccines had this efficacy because you know, this was important.
We overplayed the vaccines, and it made
people
then worry that it's not going to protect against severe disease and hospitalization. It will, but
it will protect against severe disease and hospitalization. So this is back in the day. Now, how would she know that? Well, you would have to rely on science, right, doctor? Well, listen, as of April in 2022, we knew that the mRNA vaccines had no overall mortality benefit. This was a Peter Doshi article that was in BMJ, and they combined all of the vaccine trials. So Pfizer and Moderna representing the mRNA class, and I presented this back in April of 2022. Those were combined into a single blob of data, right? So you get more power. Instead of 22,000 in each trial, now we're up to 44,000 combined trial size. And then all of the other vaccines, which are sort of the AstraZeneca, the J&J, which are the Adenovirus-vector, those were put in a pool. So these pools were then compared against each other. How did they do? Well, it's kind of fascinating that you see here overall mortality. That hazard ratio says there's about a 3% higher chance of dying if whether you got the vaccine or the placebo, meaning there's no statistical significance that these vaccines did not, according to the trials they ran, did not prevent or influence overall mortality. Nothing happened. However, they highly increased cardiovascular mortality, so much worse cardiovascular outcome. We know that 45% higher chance of kicking the bucket from a heart attack or a heart event, right? And so no bueno. And a 17% higher chance all the way at the bottom there from a non-accident mortality. So something else was happening. So accidents came out at 1.0. That's fine. Doesn't change anything about accidents in the context of the trials themselves. So I guess 37,110 total patients. They pooled them all, took a look. No influence over overall mortality. This is the data that came out of the phase 3 trials. That's all you could have said that we knew for sure. Anecdotes were coming in where hospitals were saying, gosh, these look like more vaccinated people in here or unvaccinated people having a worse outcome. But we didn't have the data. So when Dr. Birx is talking about all this stuff, she's talking in a non-scientific, hopey kind of way, where it was just this totally unrigorous, flap your gums and say whatever you want kind of approach to this whole thing, which, say what you will, but there's not a chance in the world that was accidental. This was how these people rolled, and you could do this all day long. Now, if I or somebody on our side of the story had said, hey, I'm not sure that you can say that because they would go, oh, you got this one tiny thing wrong. Oh, we have to discount everything you say. Like we had a really high standard of rigor over here on the truth side to try and get our story out. And even when we were right, and even when we were relying on solid science, we were getting censored, we were getting shadow banned, we had our reach limited, we had our channels demonetized, and we faced overt strikes and bans and having our accounts and our channels eliminated. Happened. Okay. But this is what we knew. As of April 2022, we knew that you couldn't say squat scientifically about mortality because we didn't have the data. In fact, the data we did have said you couldn't say anything about it. A 1.03 overall mortality, no bueno. Now, here's what's interesting. You know what's odd? You know what's really odd? Because you see now there's all this stuff about what's going on with AstraZeneca and J&J. Now, these are the adenovirus-vector vaccines. These aren't mRNA vaccines. This is the old stuff, the very tried and true platform. You take a deactivated virus, you put the thing in that you want your body to respond to, in this case, the spike protein. I don't think they should have put the whole spike protein in there. Different story for a different day, but they did. And guess what? Look at these numbers. Overall mortality, the hazard ratio is 37. So you had only a 37% chance of dying with these vaccines than without them. That is a pretty profound benefit right there. So that's interesting, isn't it? That we have this benefit, and out of all of the things that right now the system is saying, oh, we got to pull those, these are the two that have gotten banned, even though you have science showing that they have an overall better benefit profile. Are people still going to get injured on them? You bet. But you could then at least make some sort of a case based on the nuances involved, which would be somebody's age and comorbidity levels. You could say stuff. You could say stuff at that point and say, there are risks, but there are risks to everything. On balance, these risks are outweighed by the benefits. Therefore, we would promote this within a certain cohort of people. Obviously, not for everybody. You wouldn't put this into kids who have a 99.999% chance of, not dying from COVID. You would not do that. And as well, we see that COVID-19 mortality was way down to 0.11, so an 89% improvement there. That's just phenomenal. And cardiovascular mortality down 0.06, so not as bad on the heart, and etc. I'm not clear, though. I think there's something not quite right in these studies where non-accident or accidental mortality was lower. Why would taking these vaccines protect you from having an accident? I don't know about that one. So this is where it gets kind of weird, though, is this is really not a good look for regulators. The forest plot from that study where they combined these things into either mRNA vaccines or a group of adenovirus vaccines. What's really weird is you see here again, the overall mortality for the mRNAs, nothing, no change, 0. However, COVID-19 deaths were down a little bit, but cardiovascular deaths were up. And you combine those two right there. Oh, let me get my laser pointer out so you can see. So your COVID-19 deaths were down a little bit here in the mRNA vaccines, but the cardiovascular deaths, the heart attack deaths, were higher. Also, non-accident, non-COVID-19 deaths, tiny bit higher, but not statistically too far off. But you combine these two, and then you get 0 benefit. Saved a few, lost a few. Oops. So there's no real clear benefit here. But because of that, because there's no real clear benefit, your next thing is to say, well, is this true across everybody? Because unfortunately, they ran these trials on healthy people. And I'll get to that in just a second. They didn't run them on the people they should have, which are the old and infirm with comorbidities. Those are the people you obviously would have selected for these particular vaccines, but they didn't want that. They wanted to put these vaccines in everybody because that's the pharma business model. You know what? They could propose that. It was up to the regulators in the FDA to say, sorry, not how this is going to go. It would have been up to the COVID task force to say, sorry, that's not even remotely how this goes. Nice try. We understand you want to stack the deck in your favor for the most bucks possible, pharma, not yours, because that's the job. But of course, we don't have a regulatory apparatus. We have the appearance one, the simulacrum of a regulatory body to put the rubber stamp of approval on it, make people go, well, this is FDA approved. Yeah, that means it's pharma friendly. That's a whole other story for another day. So let's now turn to this, because this is really quite something, I think, which was Chris Cuomo now interviewing Dr. Deborah Birx. She's changed her hairstyle here over the intervening years. Now we're going to get to the blatant attempt at rewriting history. Let's listen in.
So, Doc, AstraZeneca made a headline today pulling the vaccine. They say it's because the demand curve isn't there anymore. There are other products. Other people say it's because the other products are better than their monkey based one, and that has less side effects than AstraZeneca. And it has motivated people's paranoia about vaccines. What is your opening statement about whether or not the COVID vaccines were effective and whether they are safe compared to most vaccines?
They were very effective for what they were supposed to be used for, which was prevent severe disease and hospitalization and deaths. And that's what the vaccines were studied to do in this country, and that's what they did.
No, they were not studied for that. So I will be presenting that data very shortly, but just hold on to that. She's saying clearly they are very good at what they were designed to do and studied to do, which is to prevent severe hospitalization and death.
So, Doc, AstraZeneca made a headline today pulling the vaccine. They say it's because the demand curve isn't there anymore. There are other products. Other people say it's because the other products are better than their monkey based one, and that has less side effects than AstraZeneca. And it has motivated people's paranoia about vaccines. What is your opening statement about whether or not the COVID vaccines were effective and whether they are safe compared to most vaccines?
They were very effective for what they were supposed to be used for, which was prevent severe disease and hospitalization and deaths. And that's what the vaccines were studied to do in this country, and that's what they did. Now, the question, you're asking a broader question because a lot of people were immunized that weren't in those high-risk groups. And that's why there has to be this transparent panel and discussion. But AstraZeneca, I just want to take a second to step back. The private sector did amazing things for us in the public sector during COVID. They made us test within weeks of us asking for it. They made us monoclonal antibodies. They made us antivirals, and they made us vaccines, all within the first 9 months.
Oh, this is so horrible. They made us tests. So interestingly, when Christian Drosten out of Germany and others, they managed to somehow get through peer review the PCR test, which was used inappropriately for diagnosis. They got that through peer review in 24 hours. And it turned out years later, like, oh, they made tons of money off it. But years later, we go, oh, that was a totally inappropriate test. Remember cycle thresholds of 40 or more? Remember all that stuff? Yeah, that got through in 24 hours. Meanwhile, we just had an Ivermectin study that was completed 34 months ago, finally get published because the odious journal editors who were just in the pharma bank pockets of somehow sat on it and turned it back and asked questions and rejected it and had lots of questions and all that other stuff, which showed, again, just yet another study, this one out of Iran, showing very positive benefit for ivermectin in preventing hospitalization and death. The two things that, of course, they're saying was proven here around this, not even remotely right. Okay, carrying on.
And so that's extraordinary. What AstraZeneca is saying, and I think pretty clearly, they didn't make a second generation vaccine against the new strains. And so rightly, the use of that went way down. And so they should be saying, we're not going to make the new strain. And so we're not any longer going to make the old strain. That makes total sense. I do believe, and that's what you're getting at, were there issues with the vaccines when you've immunized millions, close to billions of people?
Were there?
Tracking that will give us critical information because I love that you had Sean on and he made the point.
I love that you have Sean on. the vaccine injured guy. Yeah, tracking that would be an awesome thing. Maybe we should start sometime, you know? That would be an amazing thing. Of course, we should have been tracking it right through, and that would have been the first 90 days post-marketing surveillance report, which we reported on, where there were 1,200 plus deaths associated within that first tiny window of the Pfizer jab being out on the markets. And of course, we never tracked this, didn't follow up, and still to this day, the CDC and NIH are very busy not studying this as fast as possible. And we even saw in the New York Times piece on vaccine, on the vaccine injured, the people who believe they're vaccine injured. And this was pointed out by Mike in Jersey back at my site. Thanks for this insight, Mike. He said, that was weird. They wrote the article in the New York Times and they said, this is the most well-studied and we had the most comprehensive safety monitoring program for these vaccines ever in history, according to the CDC. And then the next two anecdotes were by people who said, yeah, I submitted my vaccine injury reports. Nobody called me. Nobody followed up. I've been trying to get somebody to talk to me. Nobody will talk to me. Not really consistent editorially. You might want to pick different anecdotal stories about all of this to follow those two pieces together. Most comprehensive, most rigorous safety monitoring program in all of vaccine history. And oh yeah, everybody we talked to like just was shouting into a canyon with chirping crickets coming back because nobody was following up.
Point. A lot of his symptoms are similar to long COVID symptoms. Well, that makes total sense. That happens often with immunizations, that if the natural disease can cause it, then it also can sometimes be seen in certain.
Okay, yet another fun sort of misdirection here by Ms. Birx say, oh yeah, it's just a lot of, we're just going to confuse the vaccine injuries with long COVID, because long COVID's a thing, and actually long COVID is a thing, and long COVID and the vaccine injuries have a lot of overlap because both of them are probably causing the damage through the spike protein, and maybe we should not have given the entire spike protein because it's a toxic protein as a component of this vaccine, which is actually a rewriting of the immunological system, and it has a lot of symptoms that kind of overlap with long COVID. Well, guess what? Dr. Birx, here's something that in 3 years you'll figure this one out, because the rest of us figured this out 2 years ago. Somebody who already has had a bad run of COVID, who then gets vaccinated, is actually in a really bad way more likely to be impacted by this long COVID thing you're talking about at this point in time, because it's a 1-2 punch. Already spike injured, and then you give them more of the spike protein. No bueno. Not hard to tease apart, but they're going to try very hard now. Watch carefully in the narcissist prayer. They're going to try very hard to pin everything we're seeing on long COVID as much as possible. And they've been trying to do that for a while, but people have figured it out because you have this unfortunate temporal relationship, which is like, oh, they gave the jab. And then 24, 48 hours later, this terrible set of symptoms stood up and never went away. Or somebody died within that first, 1 week window. There's just too much data here. But you're watching here a blatant attempt to rewrite this particular history.
The vaccine. We should be studying that right now.
We should.
People with long COVID and vaccine reactions to come forward. Study their genetics. We're in the 21st century. We know how to solve these issues, but we're not really bringing all the pieces we have to bear.
Boy, this is frustrating. I can show you, I should dig it up, but I have slides that I produced probably no later than summer of 2020, where I was articulating this concept that the one thing we should be doing is collecting all of the data. Everybody goes in the hospital, everybody gets injured in some way, everybody has a side, just collect all the data, just collect the data. We didn't collect the data. That's the CDC's one job. They have a staff of thousands, tens of thousands. They have a budget of billions, tens of billions. They could have easily implemented these programs. Didn't have to be like nationwide. We have to cover every rural hospital. It's very complicated. Oh no, systems have to be built. Dude, go to like 10 major centers and figure it out and gather enough of a sample size that you actually have real data. This is so frustrating to hear these things now being trotted out like, you know what we should do? These things that are so obvious, and any intelligent person would have called for these things to have been done from the beginning. So that's why I call this a blatant attempt at rewriting history, and this is part of the CYA tour. Clearly, Dr. Birx is interested in trying to resurrect her shattered image. But you know how you don't do that, Deborah? You don't do that by continuing the gaslighting and coming out with this, oh, gee, you know what would be great is if we did the right things. Yeah, you didn't do the right things when you had the chance. You were in a position to do the right things. Now you don't. So it's kind of useless at this stage, don't you think?
But is the reason because they don't want to know, the they being the deep state, big pharma, the government, whatever boogeyman you want to fill in?
Good question.
Because the truth is the vaccines didn't really work and there are way more side effects and more people got sick than got better as a result of it.
Well, that's why we need all the people to come forward that have had reactions, because I'm not sure all of them have been reported. Do I think it's millions? No. Could it be thousands? Yes. But
that's why we just need these people to come forward. But come forward to who? Come forward to where, Deborah? I mean, where should they come forward to? They've tried to come forward. Of course, Facebook was busy banning any vaccine injury self-assembly groups of people who tried to get together. We saw the same thing on YouTube, just shutting down this conversation over and over again. That is in part the deep state, because now we know that there's a censorship industrial complex and the White House and the NSA and the FBI and the CIA and CISA and DHS, we're all in there busy saying, oh no, we can't have any misinformation, malinformation, whatever. And we saw this over and over again. So who come forward to who? I have not yet seen a single CDC cattle call for people who think they're vaccine injured. They're not interested. They don't call people back. They're not reaching out to doctors. They're not doing anything. They don't want to know. They clearly don't want to know. So it's very disingenuous to say, oh, you know what people should do? They should come forward if they think they're vaccine injured. And yes, it is millions. And we know that because we can just look at the disability rolls from the employment report and discover that it's about 3 million people who are too disabled to work. That's just there. That's the data there. Look at Ed Dowd stuff. Look at Dave Fairtex's writings over at Peak Prosperity. These things are tracked and we check them out all the time. So that's part of it. All right. Anyway, enough of that stuff because that's just all malarkey as far as I'm concerned. Now, this is what's fascinating. So remember, she said, oh, these vaccines, of course, they did what they were supposed to do, which is block the disease and death. That's what they do. They block disease and death. All right, let me see if I've got that. Yeah, that's all run right. So this was in the BMJ. This is the Doshi article. And they wrote this back in, when was this? Probably 2021, I believe, or this might have been 2020. Yeah, this was December of 2020, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty sure that's right. And they wrote here, none of the current trials for these vaccines are designed to detect a reduction in any serious outcomes, such as hospitalizations, intensive care use, or deaths. They didn't design them that way. They were really only asking the question, do we have detectable PCR hits, positive hits, in people to say they have COVID? And they waited until they got 162 people or 160, or whatever the number was, people who had a positive hit on the placebo side. And then they said, there, that's it. We're all done. More people have gotten detectable levels of COVID without the shot than who had the shot. Now, that's the first question you might ask. Do we have a detectable level of the virus? But as we know, you can have detectable levels of the virus that aren't clinically meaningful. So the next question you would ask is, does this vaccine prevent hospitalization? And finally, does it prevent death? And then maybe longer term, does it prevent people from getting a longer term thing? And then you might want to also ask, does it prevent transmission? None of those things were actually baked into these trials. None of them. You might ask why. I'll tell you why. Pfizer wanted to leap over the smallest hurdle it possibly could and get regulatory approval to get these things into as many arms as possible. And they wanted to show that with as little data as possible. And the regulators said, sounds good to us, and that's what they did. Carrying on, many may assume that successful phase 3 studies will mean that we have proven a way of keeping people from getting very sick and dying from COVID-19 and a robust way to interrupt viral transmission. Herd immunity, remember? Yet the current phase 3 trials are not actually set up to prove either, says Peter Doshi. He explains that all ongoing phase 3 trials for which details have been released are evaluating mild, not severe disease, and they will be able to report final results once around 150 participants develop symptoms. That's what they did. Carrying on, But Doshi raises another important issue that few or perhaps none of the current vaccine trials appear to be designed to find out, which is whether there is a benefit in the elderly despite their obvious vulnerability to COVID-19. So actually, let me correct. This came out in October 21st of 2020. That's what that little number means down at the bottom there. If the frail elderly are not enrolled into vaccine trials, they write here, in sufficient numbers to determine whether there is a reduction in cases in this population, there can be little basis for assuming any benefit against hospitalization or mortality, he warns. For example, why children, immunocompromised people, and pregnant women have been largely excluded, whether the right primary endpoint has been chosen, whether safety is being adequately evaluated, and whether gaps in our understanding of how our immune system responds to COVID-19 are being addressed. Yeah, none of this is being addressed. So they threw in healthy people, basically, 18 to 65. I mean, they just threw healthy people in there and then just looked for detectable COVID on a PCR test. That was it. That was the study. That was the whole study. And by the way, they couldn't point. They did not have anything else to point to say these things are safe and effective, because in their own trials, just as many people died. In fact, a few more people died in the vaccine arm than in the control arm. So there was no mortality benefit. There was no transmission benefit, and they couldn't even point to any reduction in hospitalization. None of that is actually in the data, but that's the message they went forward with. Hard. Remember, you got to get your shot or you'll kill grandma, right? That was the messaging. Well, that implies that if I get my shot, grandma's no longer at risk because I'm not transmitting it. Did they have transmission data in order to make that statement? The answer is no. That's the truth. So now we cut over. This was on Patrick Bet-David's show, and this is our good friend here. Just kidding, sarcastic statement there. Chris Cuomo talking about this.
I'll tell you something else that's going to get you a lot of hits.
You bet.
I am taking a, what do they call it? Like a regular dose, whatever. They're trying to build up of ivermectin. Ivermectin was a boogeyman early on in COVID.
You couldn't talk about it.
That was wrong. We were given bad information about ivermectin. The real question is,
we were given bad information. Who were you given that bad information by? You're in a position to know. You actually were given the information. Who gave it to you? Was it your editor? Let's talk to them now. Was it your senior editor? Let's talk to them. Was it the head of CNN? Let's talk to them. Was it a person that wandered over from Anthony Fauci's office? Well, let's talk to them. So inquiring minds, Chris, would like to know who we were given bad information. That's part one. Part two is it's your job as a journalist to, and I know you're not actually one, but I'm just saying, let's pretend. If you were a real journalist, your job would be to evaluate that information, right? You always have to consider sources and conflicts of interest and whether or not they're just blowing smoke up your rear, or whether they're just flat out wrong because they're not as expert as they claim to be, or whether there's a difference of opinion. And there was plenty of sources you could have gone to discover the actual reality of this situation, but you didn't. Now you're vaccine injured, and you are one of those people, apparently, for whom ivermectin is an appropriate treatment, because for some people who are vaccine injured, ivermectin actually helps alleviate symptomology very strongly. So I'm glad it's working for you. Let's carry on.
Why? Everyone's going to say, Joe Rogan was right. No, Joe Rogan was saying, yeah, he was right. But that's not what matters. What matters is the entire clinical community knew that ivermectin couldn't hurt you. They knew it, Patrick. I know they knew it. How do I know? Because now I'm doing nothing but talking to these clinicians who at the time were overwhelmed by COVID, and they weren't saying anything. Not that they were hiding anything, but it's cheap, it's not owned by anybody, and it's used as an antimicrobial, antiviral in all of these different ways, and has been for a long time.
For malaria for over almost 20 years.
Yeah. So, and my doctor, who is now my doctor, was using it during COVID on her family and on patients, and it was working for them. So they were wrong to play scared on that. Didn't know that at the time. Know it now. Admit it now. Reporting on it now.
Reporting on it now. Now that it's okay. Now that, the veil is lifted a little. So I actually think we have to consider this in the sweep of, remember let me go back. May of 2020, I reported on the PRA furin cleavage site and the fact that that was a signature that was pretty much a smoking gun showing that this virus had come out of a lab and it was part of a lab construct. And that was a not okay thing to say. For all of May, June, July, I was getting hits for it. I was getting a ding. I got a strike, August, September, October, November, nothing. Couldn't get it there. Oh, you're just a crank. What a crackpot. What a conspiracy theorist. December, oh, you nut. January, oh, all of a sudden we could talk about it. And it was like a cloud lifted. It's one of these mysterious things where, suddenly the system allows you to talk about things. Well, now the system is allowing us to talk about Dwizabin 2, the drug which shall not be named, which I shortened to Dwizabin. Dwizabin 2 is my code name for Ivermectin. I had to use that for a long time because it was an automatic ban. I guess the veil that is lifted on that a little bit, and now we can talk about it. Apparently, I guess that's what I'm reading into this, is that now it's okay. But why was it not okay for a while? And you understand, he said something else very important in there, which is, it turns out Ivermectin's a very safe drug. It's not just safe, it's ridiculously safe. And I've talked about this extensively in this beautiful toxicology review of over 500 papers by Jacques Decote, the famous French toxicologist, showed just how safe it is. It was ridiculously safe. It has a therapeutic window that's a country mile wide. And he knows this now, so good. But why? And why now? And how should we be thinking about this?
I'll tell you.
Let's remember, though, this.
People who are injecting drugs for animals and horse.
And people telling them to. Oh, my God. What person? You talk about cancel culture and who to shame. Ivermectin, a dewormer, really?
They are shaming themselves. No one has to shame them. They're shaming themselves.
No, they need to be shamed.
Yeah.
They need to be called out and shamed, brother.
You got to wonder. Does Chris Cuomo call anybody else brother? Is that just another narcissistic affect of attempting to appear normal? I don't know. So I like how it ends with both their eyes closed. So these two jamokes here obviously were part of Disinformation Central, CNN being one of the more heavy disinformation-y campaign areas out there. I'm very sorry for people who got their information primarily from NPR, the New York Times, and CNN, because they were obviously the most misinformed, malinformed people, much to their detriment. A lot of them got injured. A lot of them got killed because they were following bad information. This was really bad information right here. Oh my God, it's a horse dewormer. Yeah, no, I mean, that like 8 seconds of Googling and you find out that was just a talking point trope put out there by a pharma company through a PR agency, and you guys bought it and swallowed it hook, line, and sinker, and did therefore embarrassed yourselves and shamed yourselves. Like, this is so shameful. I mean, this is really deeply shameful what they did here. So, and by the way, let's not forget the worst of the bad. And Lena Wen is right up there, one of the worst of the worst. Let's listen into this.
Do you believe that race is, the variables are, and what the messaging should be?
My main concern is that we're not going to reach herd immunity because of vaccine hesitancy. And I know that's hard.
Dr. Lena, we were never going to achieve herd immunity through this vaccine ever, because obviously to do that, it would have to stop transmission. And there was no data showing that it stopped transmission. In fact, we had one of the earliest studies came out of Thailand showing that the nasopharyngeal swabs of people who had been vaccinated, they had some of the highest viral loads that they'd seen, even higher than people who were not vaccinated. Therefore, they were expelling these virus particles. We had data right from the beginning. That was early 2021 data, by the way. We had data right from the beginning, Dr. Wen, that this whole thing of herd immunity was never going to be part of the game. We knew that.
For a lot of people to believe who desperately want the vaccine right now, and they're thinking, oh, well, it's just a small percentage of people who are actually anti-vaxxers. And that's true. There is the anti-science, anti-vaxxer contingent.
By anti-science, you mean people who actually read the papers and understood that everything you just said up to this point was complete junk? I was one of those. Hands up, full on. You are the one who is actually anti-science. You are the one who is actually deeply anti-logic, anti-reason, and also anti-human. Very, very disgusting what we're seeing here. This is inexcusable in any time frame.
But I think that there are many more people, millions of people, who, for whatever reason, have concerns about the vaccine, who just don't know what's in it for them. And we need to make it clear to them that the vaccine is the ticket back to pre-pandemic life. And the window to do that is really narrowing. I mean, you were mentioning, Chris, about how all these states are reopening. They're reopening at 100%. And we have a very narrow window to tie reopening policy to vaccination status. Because
to tie reopening status to policy to vaccination status. Oh my God, this is the worst of the worst. This is really, really awful. But anyway, this is just to set the stage and remind everybody what an awful journalist, I'm going to use double air quotes, Chris Cuomo really is. He's just really just absolutely does not deserve a rehabilitation tour or another swing at the ball. Absolutely failed comprehensively, completely, totally. In every possible way, just an intellectual failure of the highest order, but also a moral failure and a moral failing. But you know what? That's kind of a family affair. Let's now to combine. Let's listen on this. This is his brother Andrew Cuomo, who was, of course, governor of New York during the time when most of the COVID shenanigans went down, and including this is the gentleman. Just look at this face while he's talking. Just remember, this is the guy who personally made the decision that the right thing to do was to take sick people from hospitals because they were overcrowded because they were doing this ventilator and remdesivir bull stuff. Take those sick people and offload them into nursing homes. You could study public health for decades, but you'll never find the chapter which says that a good thing to do would be to take very sick people, potentially with communicable diseases like pneumonia, possibly even COVID, whatever they had, and ship them into old folks' homes where the most vulnerable are hanging out. So just remember, this is the guy, this guy.
I believe if government were to now say, we just made a finding that there's a new virus and everyone should do X, Y, and Z, the amount of compliance with X, Y, and Z would be much, much lower than it was at the beginning of COVID, because people do not trust the government, especially on this issue, the way they did at the beginning. And that would be a complicating factor, right? When you have people who just don't listen, because government had no capacity to enforce any of this. You must wear a mask. And people wore masks in New York. But if they said, I'm not wearing a mask, there was nothing I could do about it. You must close your private business. I won't. Well, there was nothing I could really do about it. It was really all voluntary, and it was extraordinary when you think about it, that society acted with that uniformity voluntarily, because I had no enforcement capacity. So you have a...
It was all voluntary. Really? You know, Andrew, that there were people who were fired from their jobs for refusing the vaccine, or I would call it, say, resisting. Refusing makes it seem like, you know, it's something other than it was. They were resisting the vaccine. They maybe wanted to wait for better data. Maybe they had a good reason. Maybe they already had an anaphylactic shock in their background. Maybe they just had misgivings for some reason. Maybe they'd already seen somebody else get it and things go bad for them. There are a lot of compelling reasons why somebody may have decided that it was not correct for them, but that didn't matter because you and your administration fired these people. And by the way, they then sued to get back pay and reinstated, and that was still turned down by the highly corrupt, really disgusting New York State judicial system, which is just broken beyond repair. You want to say, what are the reasons, Andrew, that people don't trust government and don't trust the court system? Is because of everything you did and everything that's going on there right now. It's obviously not trustworthy. You'd have to be a moron to trust either the state apparatus of government in New York State or its court system at this point. Obviously. I mean, we all know that. I mean, that's easy, right? But to say it was all voluntary, this is a form of gaslighting. And we are now down to that last part of the narcissist prayer, right? Which was, you know, there was really nothing we could do about it. You know, I didn't have enforcement capability, but we did it. But you know what? People could have ignored it. Nothing really bad happened. But if it was bad, you know, it wasn't that big a deal because, you know, we delivered money and we got past it. But even, if it was a big deal, wasn't my fault. I didn't even have enforcement capability. And if it was that bad, you know what? I was just trying to do the best I could. Oh, you know what? It was actually voluntary. If anything bad that happened to anybody is because they chose to be good citizens and follow along with our edicts and issuances. Wow, what a narcissist. I'm thinking the Cuomo family might not be the sharpest scissors in the drawer. I mean, this guy comes off as a complete moron. Chris Cuomo, same thing. I mean, I just, all due respect, I guess, and I'm not, actually, I don't, no respect whatsoever. They clearly come off as ignorant as all get out. Okay, so fine. But what I'm going to reject right here, right now, is this whole thing of what they're trying to do to rewrite the history and tell us that the vaccines really were effective when they weren't, and when they didn't have the data, and them saying things and trying to backfill and say, now we know what we know. We were right to say what we did then because now, or the worst thing that I hate the most when they say, if everything had been different, of course, we would have been doing the right things, right? That's the Sam Harris defense. Like, if this had actually been a really lethal virus, I would have been in the right. Of course, that's just fantasy role playing in your own brain when you're at that level. So, there are three parts to a good I'm sorry, a mea culpa that counts, right? There's three things you have to do. First, you have to acknowledge it. You have to acknowledge the situation and say you're very sorry for what happened. None of these people are doing it because they're all full-blown narcissists with heavy-duty sociopathic cluster B personalities, okay? You say you're sorry. That's part one. You acknowledge it. I'm very sorry for what happened. I understand you were hurt. And then you make amends. You hold yourself accountable, right? And you work to rectify the situation. Good apologies, right? They refrain from finger pointing and what's called jading. That's justify, argue, defend, explain. So just avoid that. Like, don't argue it. Don't defend it. Don't try and explain it. Well, we were doing the best we could at the time. None of that. You acknowledge the harms and you hold yourself accountable and you say, listen, let's make this better. The government would come forward and say, listen, we're going to do everything we can to support the people who have vaccine injuries, which of course they're not doing. You know what they're doing? I think only 13 people out of millions and tens of thousands who filed the claims, only 13 have managed to get payments. I think the average payment's like $1,400 after you go through this exhaustive government ringer to try and get to your $1,400. And they throw every lawyer against you and make you pull out your entire case reports and pour through them with a fine tooth comb to try and find a way to deny your claim. Of course, that's not helping, right? So the opposite of making amends is what's happening in this stage. And then finally, there's this repentance, right? Repentance means that you've said sorry in a way where we can believe it'll never happen again, because what you've done is you've changed the operating system so that that thing you did doesn't happen again, right? I think we're all familiar with this idea of like, hey, what about this person who's drunk, right? And they get drunk and they just cause damage in the relationship. Maybe they back over your dog, or they crash the car again, or they, get into these wild tirades when they're drunk and they yell and scream and they cause a lot of emotional damage. And then the next day they say they're sorry. They acknowledge the situation. They even make amends and say, I'll take you out to dinner. Let me buy you a new dog. But they don't go through the last part because they're going to keep drinking. So it's a sorry that doesn't mean anything. It's a useless sorry. You can stand there and try and receive the sorry, but it's meaningless because the system is still in place for that to happen again, right? So what do we need in this case? What we need to understand exactly how and why useful repurposed drugs such as hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, why they were demonized, why they weren't used, why we got really nasty stuff like remdesivir pushed through that same system in record-breaking speed, why it was that people who had figured out how to manage this whole thing, why they actually were treated the worst and abused and given the hostile treatment by the system, while the people who were doing the worst actually found themselves failing upwards. Lena Wen's got a great career now, and she was absolutely wrong. Fauci is still walking around a free man. That's no good, right? I don't know what Ralph Barrick is still doing with a lab, et cetera, and so forth. So until we get to that part where we can understand what changes have been made such that we can be certain that the offense will not happen again, none of this counts. This is just a CYA tour that is meaningless. And if you want to really get aggravated by the whole thing, you will listen to this.
But what we do when we do this is we look at the risks and we look at the benefits. And to just put this in perspective, if we have a group of 12 to 17-year-olds who are working to vaccinate over the next 4 months, and we can vaccinate 1 million of them, which would be great strides, over the next 4 months, we could expect 30 to 40 of these mild, self-limited cases of myocarditis. And for that, if we were to vaccinate all 1 million, we would avert 8,000 cases of COVID, 200 hospitalizations, 50 ICU stays, and 1 death. And so we weigh the risks as well as the benefits.
No, first off, those are bogus statistics. Those are absolutely bogus statistics there that she's handing out. And I know they're bogus statistics because she told us as much later. But first, let me just say this. There is no such thing as a mild, self-limited case of myocarditis. Myocarditis means heart cells have died. That is a permanent condition. They do not repair, they do not regenerate, and there's no such thing as mild myocarditis. When you're getting your troponin C levels and, you know, because your heart cells are dying and they're dumping this stuff out into your bloodstream and they measure your levels, and that means heart cells have died. And by the way, Rochelle, easy peasy to go out there and find cases of people whose sons principally, but also some daughters, were heavily damaged by your so-called mild self-limited myocarditis. Easy, stupid easy to find all of those cases. But listen to this, and now we understand a little bit more.
There is a clear message that is coming through. This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
Oh.
And we're seeing it in the data. Unvaccinated
Jeff
Americans
Zients.
account for virtually all recent COVID-19
Nasty
hospitalizations
person.
and deaths.
We still, to this day, do not have data on people who are coming into the hospitals who are vaccinated. That is a data point that we have lacked.
What? Wouldn't that be a good data point to have? Oh, you bet. That would be a fantastic data point. But that's Rochelle Walensky in a recent hearing. She was being asked a question by Jeffords and, no, Jim Jordan, I believe. Yeah, I think it was Jim Jordan. Sorry. And he said, hey, can you tell us about, how many vaccinated versus unvaccinated really were actually dying? Because they told us this. It's the unvaccinated are in the hospitals. It's the unvaccinated. It's the unvaccinated. Well, how do you know that? And she said, we don't actually have that data. We don't really have that data. But that didn't stop her.
There is a clear message that is coming through. This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
How would she know that? How would she know it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated if she's the same person who would later say, oh, we didn't collect that data? It's that bad. It is that bad. So we are being trickle truth people. We are this much closer to common knowledge. This is something we got to get to. And remember, this is Jeff Zients right here. Remember this is a golden oldie. This one will bring back your fond memories of the whole thing. Saying in October of 2021, for the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death. For yourselves, your families, and the hospitals you may soon overwhelm. Wow, how can you say something like that in a White House position? It's just scolding and shaming because pandemic of the unvaccinated. Well, I was so disappointed because that was not a winter of severe illness and death in my household. Neither was 2022, neither was 2023. So I'm still waiting for my promised winter of severe illness and death, but haven't got it so far. But this Jeff Zients guy, what a nasty piece of work he is, obviously. And so at any rate, we need to keep exposing these people. We need to keep talking about them, and they deserve all the ridicule you can possibly heap upon them. Because remember, they are wearing no clothes. So keep pushing, everyone. We are very close to winning on this. They are clearly in retreat. They're starting to throw some sacred things under the bus, but do not let them get away with their CYA tour stuff. Do not let them come forward and say, let me gaslight you further. Let me try and explain that this was actually your fault. Let me explain why it wasn't that bad. Let's explain, justify, argue, defend, explain, doing everything except what an actual functioning, mature adult should do, which is to say, I'm sorry. I made some mistakes. I was clearly wrong. Here's why I got it wrong. And here's how I'm not going to get it wrong again. Right? that would be how you would give it a proper apology in this particular case. They're not doing that because they have no interest in a proper apology, but they are interested in resurrecting and burnishing their own images because, of course, they're flaming narcissists. Now, I am going to go from here over to Peak Prosperity, and I issue alerts very, very, very rarely. This is Friday, May 10th, 2024. The sun is acting up. If you don't know about the coronal mass ejections headed our way, listen, hopefully it just results in some very interesting northern lights tonight. If you're watching this on Friday, take a look outside tonight. Could be really spectacular. But there are not one, not two, not four, but 6 of these coronal mass ejections headed our way. And there's the possibility, it's a possibility, a chance that something goes a little haywire in our electrical systems and all that. So for my subscribers, please follow me back to Peak Prosperity. I got an alert. We're going to talk about it. All right. For everybody else, thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time, and hopefully we still have a grid that's functioning and all of this equipment still works. Bye-bye for now, and remember, keep pushing.